John the Baptist had proclaimed to everybody that the Messiah was coming, and then when Jesus was baptized by him, had pointed people to Jesus. But instead of Jesus establishing the kingdom and throwing out the Romans and giving political power back to the Jewish people, he was just going around the synagogues teaching people. He was healing people, but he was not raising a rebellion against Rome. And consequently, John was now in prison, and it wouldn't be long before he would be executed, foreshadowing the fact that Jesus himself would be executed. So there is some surprise on John's part that Jesus does not seem to be doing what everybody expected of him. And so he posed the question through two of his disciples, "Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?" And so these disciples asked this question to Jesus. At that very hour, Jesus cured many of infirmities, afflictions, and evil spirits, and to many blind he gave sight. Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and tell John the things you have seen and heard, that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them, and blessed is he who is not offended because of me." When the messengers of John had departed, he began to speak to the multitudes concerning John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? Well, what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who are gorgeously apparelled and live in luxury are in king's courts. But what did you go out to see? A prophet. Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. This is the one of whom it is written, 'Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you.' For I say to you, among those born of women, there is not a greater prophet than John the Baptist. But he who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he." And when all the people heard him, even the tax collectors justified God, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the will of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. And the Lord said, "To what then shall I liken the men of this generation? What are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another and saying, 'We played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We mourned for you, and you didn't weep.' For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, 'Look, he's a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' But wisdom is justified by all her children." My name's Arthur. Thank you for joining me as we share these words from Luke chapter 7, verses 24 to 28. And may the Lord bless them to us. So John's answer was, look at what Jesus is doing. He is continuing the ministry that John himself was doing. He is preaching. John has gone ahead and Jesus has continued in a similar vein. But Jesus is healing the lame, the lepers, the deaf, the blind, even raising the dead. And so John should be encouraged that indeed the kingdom of heaven has actually begun, because God has begun to restore his people. And if Jesus was given free rein, then this course would develop further. Jesus was working personally in the lives of people to free them. He wasn't just going to come politically and change the political power system. He was changing individual lives. And that's what Jesus continues to do today. Well, when John's messengers had returned, Jesus starts talking about the ministry of John the Baptist. Many people had gone out to listen to John the Baptist. They'd been impressed by him. And so Jesus asked the question, well, you went out into the wilderness. What did you go out to see? Did you just want to see the wind blowing in the grass? No. Did you want to go and see someone dressed in fabulous clothes? No. they live in king's courts. So what did you go out to see? You went out to see a prophet. Yes, more than a prophet. You went out to see the prophet, who was the messenger of the Messiah. John had proclaimed that this is what his role was, and Jesus affirms this is his role. So the implication is that Jesus is therefore confessing that he is the Messiah, and the ministry that he is performing is an extension, a development of what the ministry of John the Baptist was. And yes, John was a prophet, and earlier in this chapter we saw the people saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people," referring this time to Jesus. So God had begun to work in the society through Jesus. John had started it, and Jesus was continuing it. And just as the people had to go out into the wilderness to see John, so if they were going to hear Jesus teaching, they had to go and find him wherever he was. And he could be found in the synagogues or out in the wilderness, by the sea, up on the mountain, out on the plain. This is the place where Jesus mainly ministered. He was not causing a political upset. He was not causing a commercial upset. He let the cities get on with their business. He was out in the deserted places, and people came to him there. And Jesus makes this fabulous declaration concerning John. "I say to you, among those born of women, there is not a greater prophet than John the Baptist." Well, the people acknowledged the Old Testament prophets, and there were two great prophets that were recognized in particular. Moses, who had given them the law and had performed many miracles delivering them from Egypt. And his ministry was seen as a precursor to the ministry of the Messiah. Indeed, Moses had said that the Lord would send a prophet like me. So there was the beginning of a recognition that Jesus was a prophet, a humble man like Moses, who had great authority. The other great prophets of the Old Testament, in terms of turning people's hearts and delivering people from evil, was the ministries of Elijah and Elisha. These people also ministered in deserted places. They were outside of the establishment. Much religious life is within the establishment. But Jesus was outside of the establishment. John the Baptist was outside of the establishment. Moses was rejected by the establishment. Elijah and Elisha were rejected by the establishment. John the Baptist was outside of the establishment. And if people were to seek God, they had to go outside of the incumbent political system to find God's prophet. But then Jesus says, "He who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he." A most intriguing statement, because we would like to think that we're in the kingdom of God, but that John is great in the kingdom of God. Yet we see that the kingdom of God has not yet been established. The chief characteristic about the kingdom of God that Jesus will establish is a person needs to be born again. Born the first time by natural birth, in other words, a man, but born again by spiritual rebirth, the Spirit of God, to become a child of God. This status is something that was still future. The kingdom of people born of the Spirit was still to come after Jesus rose from the dead. And so we find that among the people of God, there is a great distinction made between those of the Old Testament and those of the New Testament. There will be two companies. Jesus in another place talked about other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Those who are born again by the Spirit of God constitute the kingdom of God. Unless you're born again, you shall not enter the kingdom of God, Jesus said in John's Gospel. And so that's the challenge for us, to be born again, to be citizens of the kingdom of God. John the Baptist was announcing it, and he was a truly great prophet, but Jesus is greater.